My name is Riley Harper. I'm 28 years old, and if you met my family, you'd probably think everything looked normal, maybe even impressive. The kind of family that sends out polished holiday cards and knows exactly how to act in public. But what you wouldn't see is how carefully everything is arranged, including where I fit into it, which is usually somewhere off to the side, useful but not important, present but not really included, and definitely not the person anyone is paying attention to unless I forget to do something they expect me to do. Every Sunday at 6, we have dinner at my parents' house, not because we all want to, but because it's expected, and in my family, expectations are not optional. They're rules you follow without questioning. So I show up, I take my usual seat at the far end of the table, closest to the kitchen, which is convenient because it means I can get up quickly to refill drinks or clear plates without interrupting the conversation that never really involves me anyway. My dad sits at the head of the table like he's chairing a meeting. My mom sits to his right, always perfectly composed, always saying the right thing at the right time, and my older sister Lauren sits to his left, which might as well be center stage, because that's where all the attention goes. And honestly, if there were an award for being exactly what our parents wanted, Lauren would have a shelf full of them by now. That night, she was talking about her new promotion, something in corporate finance with a title long enough to make my dad smile before she even finished saying it. And he did that slow nod he always does when he's impressed, like he's approving a business deal, while my mom leaned in just slightly, asking questions, encouraging her, making it clear that this was the most important conversation happening in that room. I sat there cutting my food into smaller pieces than necessary, waiting for a moment where I could say something, anything, just to feel like I existed in the same space as them, because I had news too, not the kind that comes with a bonus or a new office, but the kind that actually changes someone's life. I had just helped a family move out of a temporary shelter into permanent housing through the nonprofit I work for, and it had taken months of paperwork and meetings and showing up for people who had no one else showing up for them. So when there was finally a pause, I said it, just one sentence, simple and direct, and my mom responded without even looking at me. "That's nice," in the same tone people use when they're being polite, but already thinking about something else. And then she turned right back to Lauren like I hadn't spoken at all. No follow-up, no question, no acknowledgement, just a clean transition back to the conversation that mattered. And my dad didn't even react, which somehow felt worse, because at least a dismissive comment would have meant he heard me. This wasn't new. It was just another version of the same pattern I'd been living in for years, where Lauren's achievements were celebrated in detail and mine were reduced to background noise. Something vaguely positive but not worth focusing on. And it wasn't like anyone ever said Riley doesn't matter. They didn't have to. It showed up in smaller ways, in who got asked follow-up questions, who got eye contact, got remembered, and who got forgotten the second they stopped speaking. By the time dinner ended, Lauren had told 3 more stories about work. My dad had offered opinions like they were facts. My mom had agreed with him in a way that sounded supportive but also strategic, and I had finished my meal quietly already, knowing what came next. I stood up, gathered the plates, and took them to the kitchen without being asked, because that's just what I do. And as I stood at the sink washing dishes that somehow always became my responsibility, I could hear them in the living room. Still talking, still engaged, still a complete circle that I was never really part of. No one called me in. No one said, "Hey, come sit with us," and honestly, I didn't expect them to, because you can't be disappointed by something you've learned not to hope for. Lauren left a few minutes later without saying goodbye to me, which is consistent for her, and my parents didn't notice. Or if they did, they didn't think it was worth mentioning. And when I finally finished cleaning up, I grabbed bag, said a quick goodnight that didn't interrupt anything, and walked out the front door like I was leaving a place I had only been visiting. On the drive back to my apartment, I kept replaying the night in my head, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. And that's what makes it so hard to explain. There's no big moment you can point to and say, that was unfair. It's just a series of small dismissals that add up over time, until you start questioning whether you're the problem, whether you're expecting too much, whether this is just how families work and you somehow miss the part where you're supposed to feel included. Growing up, Lauren was always the one people noticed first, the one teachers praised, the one relatives asked about, the one my parents described with pride, and I was the other one, the easy one, the one who didn't cause trouble, which sounds like a compliment, until you realize it also means you don't get attention unless you mess something up. My dad values results you can measure, income, titles, things you can explain in a sentence that sounds impressive, and my job doesn't fit into that. So to him it's temporary at best, irrelevant at worst, and he doesn't say that directly, but he doesn't need to. It's in the way he asks Lauren detailed questions about her work, and then turns to me and says, "So you're still doing that nonprofit thing, like it's a phase I'll eventually grow out of." My mom is different, but not better. She's more careful, more aware of how things look. She'll say things like, "We're so proud of both our girls, especially when other people are around, but when it's just us, the difference is obvious." Lauren gets admiration, I get encouragement. Those are not the same thing. Encouragement is what you give someone who hasn't quite made it yet. And in my family, I've always been treated like I'm still on my way to something that might eventually matter. When I got home that night, I stood in my apartment for a minute without turning on the lights, just listening to the quiet, and for once it felt better than being in a room full of people who didn't really see me. I set my keys down, leaned against the counter, and let the silence settle. Because at least here I didn't have to compete for attention or prove that what I do has value. But even then, part of me kept going back to the same question I've been asking myself for years. What would it take for them to actually see me? Not as the quiet one or the helpful one or the one who doesn't make things difficult, but as someone worth paying attention to. And the answer, the one I didn't want to admit, was that it might not matter what I do, because in that family the roles were already decided a long time ago, and I was never meant to be the one anyone was watching. I dropped my keys on the counter and reached for my phone without thinking, because there was only one person who ever called me just to hear how I was doing, not to check a box or keep up appearances, and right on cue there it was a voicemail from my grandmother Margaret, her voice warm and unhurried, like she had all the time in the world. "Riley, I made your lemon cake today, the one you like. Come by before your mother finds out it exists." And I couldn't help but smile, because with her, nothing ever felt like a performance. There was no ranking system, no comparison, no invisible scoreboard keeping track of who was worth more. I was just Riley, not the backup version of someone else. She lived in Ridgefield, in this old house that most people in my family pretended didn't exist anymore, the kind of place with creaky floors and uneven windows and a porch that leaned just enough to make you wonder how it was still standing. But to me it never felt broken, it felt real, like it had nothing to prove and didn't care if anyone judged it. I started visiting her more a few years ago, partly because she always asked, and partly because she was the only person who noticed. When I didn't show up, she remembered everything: my schedule, my cases at work, even the small details didn't think mattered, like the name of a client's kid or the fact that I hate driving in the rain. And she'd ask about those things, like they were important, like I was important. The first time I realized how different she was from the rest of my family was after one of those Sunday dinners. I drove straight to her house without calling, still irritated, still replaying everything that had happened, and she opened the door before I even knocked, like she knew I'd be there. She took one look at my face and said, "Kitchen, no questions." No small talk, just a direction. And within 5 minutes I was sitting at her table with a plate in front of me and a cup of tea I didn't ask for, and she didn't push me to explain. She just sat across from me and waited, which somehow made it easier to talk than if she had asked. I told her what happened, or at least the version I was used to telling, the careful one, the one where I downplayed everything, so it didn't sound like I was complaining, and she listened without interrupting, but when I finished, didn't say, "They mean well," or "That's just how your family is," she said. "You know, they don't see you clearly, right?" Just like that, simple and direct. And I remember blinking at her like she had just broken some unspoken rule because no one in my family ever said things that plainly, especially not about each other. "It's not your job to shrink so other people can feel comfortable," she added. And I laughed a little, not because it was funny, but because it sounded like something I wasn't allowed to believe, and she noticed that too. "You think I'm joking," she said. "I'm not." And that was the thing about her. She didn't soften the truth to make it easier to accept, but she also didn't make you feel bad for needing time to understand it. Over the years, those visits became routine, not scheduled, not formal, just something I did whenever I needed to. Remember what it felt like to be seen without having to earn it. We'd sit on the porch in the afternoons, her in the same chair she'd had forever, me on the step with a glass of something cold, and she'd talk about things no one else in my family ever mentioned, not in a dramatic way, just casually, like they were part of the furniture stories, about when she was younger, about choices she made, and things she didn't get to choose, about people who were important to her long before I existed. And sometimes she'd stop mid-sentence and look at the house like it was listening, like it held on to things, even when people tried to forget them. One afternoon, maybe 3 months before she passed, we were sitting out there like usual, and she got quiet in a way that felt different, not reflective, not nostalgic, just focused, and she said, "There are things I've hidden in this house." Riley and I remember thinking she meant photos or letters or something sentimental. Something that made sense, so I nodded like I understood, but she shook her head slightly. "Not memories," she said, like she had heard my assumption before. I said it out loud, "Something you'll need, but only when the time comes," and I laughed. Again, because it sounded mysterious in a way that didn't fit her. She was usually so straightforward, and I said, "Okay, so what, I just show up one day, and the house tells me what to do?" And she smiled, but not in a joking way. More like she was amused that I didn't realize she was serious. "You'll know when to come," she said, and then she changed the subject like she hadn't just said something that didn't make sense at all. I didn't push it because with her, I had learned that if something mattered, she'd come back to it in her own time. And besides, part of me didn't want to overthink it. I was used to being the one who reads too much into things, the one who tries to find meaning where there isn't any. But with her, it never felt like that. Even when I didn't fully understand what she meant, it still felt intentional, like she was setting something in motion that I wasn't ready to see yet. The last time I saw her, she walked me to the door like she always did, even though I told her she didn't have to, and she reached out and adjusted my jacket like I was still a kid. "You're stronger than they think," she said, not as encouragement, but as a statement, like she was reminding me of something I should already know, and then she added almost as an afterthought, "and smarter than they're prepared for," which made me smile because it sounded like her version of a warning, except I didn't know what I was supposed to be prepared for. I drove home that night feeling lighter than I had all week, not because anything had changed at my parents' house or at work or anywhere else, but because she had this way of shifting how things felt, without changing the facts, like she could take the same situation and show you a version of it where you weren't the problem, where you didn't have to earn your place by being smaller. And I held on to that even when I didn't fully understand everything she had said, because if there was one thing I trusted, it was her, and if she believed there was something in that house I would need someday, then even if I didn't know what it was yet, I knew she wouldn't have said it unless it mattered. I kept my hand on the bracelet in my coat pocket as I walked into the lawyer's office, like if I let go of it for even a second, Something would shift without me noticing and I'd miss it. The room itself was exactly what you'd expect: too cold, too quiet, a long table that made 5 people feel like a formal meeting. Instead of a family, beige walls, no windows open. The kind of place where nothing personal is supposed to happen, which is ironic considering what we were there for. My dad was already seated at the head of the table, legs crossed, hands folded, like he had practiced this position in the mirror. My mom next to him, posture perfect, expression controlled, not sad, not really, just composed in a way that felt more like preparation than grief. And across from me, my sister sat scrolling through her phone like she was waiting for a delayed flight instead of the reading of our grandmother's will. And for a second, I wondered if I had missed something. If maybe I was the only one who thought this moment should feel different. The lawyer, Gordon Blake, introduced himself in a tone that suggested we should already know who he was, which we didn't, and that alone should have been a red flag, because my grandmother never mentioned him, not once, not in passing, not in any story, not even in frustration. And yet here he was holding a leather folder like it contained something official enough to override everything I thought I knew. And he didn't waste time. Just opened the folder and started reading, in that flat, practiced voice lawyers use when they want to sound neutral, even when the content isn't. And the first part went exactly how my dad would have written it. Himself, to Richard and Vivian Harper, management of the family trust. Valued at approximately $1.8 million, including all liquid assets and investment accounts. My dad didn't react much, just a small nod. Like this confirmed something he had already accepted as fact. My mom's lips pressed together in what looked like a polite version of satisfaction, and my sister barely looked up, just a quick glance, then back to her phone like she expected her part to be next, and it was. To Lauren Harper, the primary residence in Westport, along with the associated investment portfolio. And this time my sister did look up, not surprised, not emotional, just validated. Like this was exactly where she believed she belonged. My dad turned slightly toward her, just enough to acknowledge it without saying anything out loud, because in our family approval is often silent but very clear. Then the lawyer paused for half a second, just enough to separate what came next. And I realized I was holding my breath without meaning. To Riley Harper, the property located at 14 Birch Hollow Road, Ridgefield, Connecticut. And that was it. No added value, no explanation. No mention of assets, just an address. And for a moment, I thought maybe he wasn't finished, maybe there was another page, another paragraph, something that made it make sense. But he closed the folder like the story was complete. I stared at him, waiting for the part where he corrected himself, where he clarified that there had been a mistake, because that house wasn't a gift. It was a liability, an abandoned property with a leaking roof, unstable floors, and an electrical system that hadn't worked in years, a place no one in my family wanted anything to do with, which is exactly why it had been left untouched for so long, and everyone in that room knew that. My dad turned to me slowly. Not concerned, not even curious, just composed. "Your grandmother knew your limitations, Riley," he said, like he was explaining something reasonable, something I should accept without question. "She gave you what you could handle." And my mom added, "At least you have something." Not everyone gets that, in that same tone she uses when she wants to sound supportive, while making sure you understand your place. And my sister didn't say anything at all, which somehow said more than if she had, because she didn't need to comment on something that didn't affect her. I looked back at the lawyer. "That's not right," I said, my voice steady, even though everything else felt off. "She told me she would take care of me," and the second I said it, I knew how it sounded in that room, like I was challenging something official, something documented, something already decided. My dad leaned forward slightly. "Are you calling your grandmother a liar?" And there it was, the shift, not just dismissal, but pressure, the kind that makes you question whether Speaking up is worth it, and the lawyer didn't intervene, didn't clarify, didn't offer any explanation that could have balanced the situation. He just sat there silent, which felt less like neutrality and more like agreement. I sat back in my chair and looked at each of them, trying to find even a hint that this didn't feel right to them either. But all I saw was acceptance, like this outcome made perfect sense in a system I was never fully part of. And that's when the realization hit, not all at once, but clear enough to settle. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a last-minute change or a clerical error. This was intentional. And I was the only one in the room who hadn't been prepared for it. I stood up before anyone could say anything else, not because I had something dramatic to add, but because staying there felt like agreeing, like accepting a version of reality that didn't match what I knew. I picked up my coat, I didn't look at any of them again, and walked out, the sound of the door closing behind me louder than it should have been, like it was marking something, not just the end of that meeting. But the moment everything shifted, in the parking garage, I sat in my car without turning it on, hands on the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened without letting it turn into something bigger than it already was. Because if I let myself fully believe that, my grandmother had chosen to leave me with nothing but a collapsing house while giving everything else to the people who barely showed up for her, then I'd have to accept that everything I thought I knew about her was wrong, and that didn't make sense. Not with the way she spoke to me, not with the things she said, not with the look she gave me the last time I saw her, like she was making sure I understood something I hadn't figured out yet. I pulled my hand out of my pocket and looked at the bracelet, turning it slightly under the light, and for the first time since the reading, a different thought cut through the confusion. Not about what I had been given, but why. Because if there was one thing I knew about my grandmother, it was that she didn't do anything halfway, and she definitely didn't leave things unfinished. So if this was what it looked like in the surface, then maybe the surface wasn't the whole story, and maybe, just maybe, the only thing that didn't make sense yet was the part I hadn't seen. I turned the key in the ignition and headed straight for Ridgefield without giving myself time to second-guess it, because the more I thought about that address, 14 Birch Hollow Road, the less it felt like a leftover, and the more it felt like a message I hadn't decoded yet. And by the time I pulled up to the house, I understood why no one else wanted it. It looked like time had tried to erase it and got bored halfway through. The porch sagged on one side like it had given up, holding its own weight. 3 of the front windows were cracked, not shattered, just broken enough to let weather in and hope out. The gutters hung loose. Weeds had taken over the yard like they had a lease. No one planned to renew, and for a second I just sat there in my car staring at it, because this was the thing my family had written off as mine, the thing they thought I could handle. And if I'm being honest, part of me agreed with them. It didn't look like something you fix. It looked like something you walk away from. But then I remembered my grandmother sitting on that porch, looking at these same walls, like they had something to say. And suddenly it didn't feel abandoned, it felt paused. I pushed the door open and it answered with a long, low groan that sounded less like resistance and more like acknowledgement. Like it knew someone had finally come back inside. The air smelled like dust and damp wood. The kind of smell that tells you nothing has moved in a long time. The floors shifted slightly under my weight, not enough to break, but enough to remind me they could. The staircase railing was missing pieces. The ceiling had stains from years. Teas of leaks. No one bothered to fix. And somewhere above me I could hear the faint sound of something living where it shouldn't be. But even with all of that, there was something else, something quieter, something that didn't match the condition of the place, a sense that it wasn't empty in the way abandoned buildings usually are. It felt like things had been left intentionally, not forgotten. I moved into the kitchen and wiped a layer of dust off the counter with my sleeve, and that's when I saw a small framed photograph leaning against the wall. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for anything specific. A younger, version of my grandmother standing in front of this exact house, holding a baby, the yard clean, the porch straight, everything intact, and on the back in handwriting I recognized immediately it said, "For my Riley, the house remembers," and that stopped me, not because it was sentimental, but because it didn't sound like something you write, unless you mean it literally. Not like a metaphor, not like a memory, but like a fact. I set the photo down and walked through the rest of the house slower this time, paying attention, not just seeing what was broken, but noticing what didn't quite fit, sections of wall that looked slightly newer than the rest, spots where the floor had been replaced unevenly, areas that felt less like decay and more like interruption, like someone had changed something on purpose and then covered it up without caring if it mismatched. I stepped back onto the porch and pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number my coworker had given me, Frank Delaney, a contractor who apparently knew how to make bad situations slightly less bad. He answered on the third ring, and within a few hours he was standing next to me, walking through the house in silence, tapping the floors with his boot, running his hand along the walls, looking up at the ceiling like he was reading something I couldn't see yet. And when we stepped back outside, he pulled off his cap and gave me the kind of look you give someone when you're about to say something honest. 70,000 minimum, he said, and that's if nothing else surprises us, which in a house like this basically guarantees something will. I should have said no. I should have looked at the numbers, looked at my savings, looked at the reality of what I could afford, and walked away like any reasonable person would, because this wasn't an investment. It wasn't even practical. It was a risk with no clear return. But instead I heard myself say, "I'll make it work." And even as I said it, I knew it wasn't about the house anymore. It was about what my grandmother had told me, about the way she said it, about the certainty in her voice when she talked about things she didn't explain. And Frank studied me for a second, before nodding once, not convinced, but willing to go along with it. "All right," he said, "we start Monday," and just like that, the decision was made. Over the next few days, I started doing the math in my head, my savings, my credit line, what I could cut back on, what I could delay, what I could risk, and none of it added up to something comfortable, but it added up to something possible. And that was enough, because the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me that my family had been so quick to let this place go, not just because it was inconvenient, but because it didn't fit their version of value. And if there was something here, something my grandmother thought I would need, then walking away from it would mean doing exactly what they expected me to do, which suddenly felt like the one option I couldn't choose. When the crew started, the house didn't get better right away. It got worse. Walls came down, floors were pulled up, layers of damage exposed, things that had been hidden for years, and every day it looked less like a house and more like a packeted problem I had committed to solving without knowing why. But somewhere in that process, the suspense shifted. It wasn't just about fixing what was broken anymore. It was about uncovering what had been left behind. And every time a wall opened up, every time something unexpected showed up, I felt a small, steady pull forward, like I was getting closer to something I couldn't name yet. And for the first time since the will was read, I wasn't thinking about what I lost. I was thinking about what I hadn't found yet, and that difference was enough to keep me going. I was sitting on my apartment floor, sorting receipts, when my phone lit up, and the second I saw Frank's name at that hour, I knew this wasn't about a routine update. I answered before it finished ringing, and he didn't waste time with small talk, his voice lower than usual, tighter, like he was choosing every word carefully. We found something behind the living room wall, and I sat up straight without even realizing it. What kind of something, I asked, but there was a pause on his end that told me I wasn't going to get a simple answer. "I called the police," he said, and that was enough to get me on my feet, grabbing my keys, already moving. "Don't touch anything else, and don't tell your family," he added before hanging up, and the way he said it didn't feel like advice. It felt like a warning. The drive to Ridgefield took less time than it should have. I don't remember most of it. Just the rhythm of the windshield wipers And the way my hands stayed locked on the steering wheel, like letting go, would slow me down. When I pulled up, the first thing I saw were the police lights cutting through the dark, flashing against the trees, turning the whole place into something that didn't feel like mine anymore, like I had walked into the middle of something that had already started without me. Frank was on the porch, hat in his hands, face pale under the light. And he didn't say anything as I stepped out of the car, just nodded toward the door. Inside the house looked different. Not cleaner, not better, just exposed. The living room wall had been opened up, drywall torn away, wooden framing, visible dust still hanging in the air like it hadn't decided where to settle. Yet one officer was taking photos. Another stood back watching everything, without moving. And for a second, I didn't see it. I just saw the damage, the space where a wall used to be, and then my eyes adjusted to what was actually there. A gap between two layers of wall, intentional, too clean to be accidental, and sitting in that space like it had been waiting was a steel box. It wasn't large, maybe 2 feet long, a foot wide, but it didn't look like something that belonged in a house like this. It looked deliberate, heavy coated in a layer of dust that suggested it had been there for a long time, and even before I got closer, I felt something shift. Not fear exactly, but awareness, like whatever was inside that box had been meant for me and me alone. I stepped forward slowly, my shoes crunching against debris, and knelt down in front of it, the metal cold, even through the dust, and that's when I saw it engraved on the lid in clean, precise letters, E.H., my initials, and for a second, everything around me went quiet. Not literally, I could still hear the officer moving behind me, Frank shifting his weight in the doorway, but none of it registered the same way, because my grandmother had put this here, not just hidden something, but hidden something specifically for me in a house she knew only I would end up with. "It's your property," one of the officers said from behind me, his tone neutral, procedural. "You can open it. We just need to document whatever's inside." And I nodded without turning around because I was still staring at the box, trying to reconcile how long it must have been sitting there. How many years, how many times people had walked past that wall without knowing what was behind it, and why she had gone to that much effort to keep it hidden. There was a combination lock on the front 4 digits, simple but not random, and I hovered my hand over it, thinking through every number that might matter. Her birthday, my birthday addresses, dates she mentioned in passing, and then I stopped, overthinking it, and tried the one number she made me repeat enough times that it stuck. March 19th, my birthday. I turned the dial one number at a time, and when it clicked open, the sound was small but definite, like a confirmation I hadn't realized I needed. I lifted the lid slowly, both hands on it, because it was heavier than it looked, and for a split second I hesitated, not because I was afraid of what I'd find, but because I knew that whatever was inside was going to change something, not just answer a question, but shift the entire reason I was there. And then I opened it. Inside, the box was divided into compartments neatly organized, nothing thrown in carelessly, everything placed with intention. And that told me more than the contents would have on their own. This wasn't something she hid in a hurry. This was something she planned, something she prepared, something she expected to be found under very specific circumstances. And as I stared down at it, I felt the first real wave of it hit. Not confusion, not disbelief, but clarity. The kind that doesn't explain everything right away but makes one thing very clear. My grandmother didn't leave me that house because it was all I could handle. She left it to me because it was the only place this could exist, and because she knew I was the only one who would keep going long enough to find it. I shifted my weight forward and reached into the box, my hand steady, even though everything else felt like it was moving too fast. And the first thing I picked up was a thick envelope, sealed with dark red wax, not decorative, not for show, deliberate, like something meant to stay closed until the exact moment. It didn't. I broke the seal carefully, the paper inside heavier than standard 4 pages. Handwritten in the one style I could recognize instantly, without needing to check the name at the top, Margaret Ann Whitfield Harrow, and underneath that the words Last Will and Testament dated 18 months before the version Gordon. Blake had read in that office, and I didn't need a lawyer to tell me what that meant. I just needed to read. I scanned the first page quickly, then slowed down as the details started to line up, in a way that made everything else fall apart. The trust, all of it. The accounts, the assets, the house in Westport, everything was left to me. Not split, not managed, not filtered through anyone else, just transferred directly. And I felt something in my chest tighten, not because of the money, but because of the certainty this wasn't a vague intention. This was clear, structured, witnessed, notarized, 2 signatures at the bottom, confirming it. No room for interpretation, no loopholes, no confusion. Just the truth written down in a way that couldn't be explained away. I flipped to the last page and saw the final lines: Richard Harper $1, Vivian Harper $1, and beneath that in her handwriting, smaller but unmistakable, so they know I did not forget them. I simply did not forgive. And that was the moment the room shifted again. Not physically, but in the way. Everything connected, because this wasn't just about inheritance. It was about intent. About a decision she made long before she passed, knowing exactly what she was doing and why. I set the will down carefully and reached for the second item, another set of pages, this time not formal, no legal structure, just a letter. The kind you write when you know the person reading it is the only one who matters. The first line stopped me before I could go any further. My dearest Riley, if you are reading this, then they did exactly what I feared they would do, and I had to pause. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I understood it too quickly, like the pieces I had been trying to arrange suddenly locked into place without asking for permission. I kept reading her handwriting steady, no hesitation in the strokes, no sign of confusion or doubt, just clarity. She wrote about the last 2 years, about the pressure from my parents, about the way decisions started being made around her, instead of with her, about money moving in ways she didn't authorize. Accounts changing without explanation, documents appearing that she never signed, and every sentence built on the one before it until there was no way to dismiss it as misunderstanding or paranoia they have been taking from me. Riley, she wrote, not borrowing, not managing, taking, and I could feel my grip tighten on the paper as I read, because this wasn't speculation, this was documentation. She had tracked it, noted it, marked every inconsistency, every unauthorized transfer, every signature that wasn't hers, and she wrote it all down, knowing she might not get the chance to say it out loud. I kept going, forcing myself to read every word, even when it got harder to process. I tried to stop it while I could, she wrote, but I was alone in it, and they counted on that. They counted on me, not wanting to cause a scene, not wanting to. I believed my own family would do this. And that line hit differently, because I knew exactly what she meant. The hesitation, the second-guessing, the way you convince yourself you're overreacting, because the alternative is worse, because the alternative means the people you're supposed to trust are the ones you need to protect yourself from. She explained why she created the box, why she hid everything, why she left the house to me specifically. I needed someone who would look past what they were told and see what was actually there. She wrote someone they underestimated, and I let out a short breath at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was accurate in a way that felt almost strategic. She knew exactly how they saw me, and she used it. The last page of the letter was shorter, more direct. They will tell you, I didn't love you enough to give you more, she wrote, and I had to stop for a second because I had heard that exact version of the story already, just phrased differently. Your limitations, what you could handle. At least you have something. And she cut through all of it in one line. The truth is, I loved you too much to let them take everything, and that was it. No explanation, no justification, just a statement that didn't need anything else. I folded the letter back along the original creases, my hand slower now, more deliberate, like I didn't want to rush through the part that mattered most. And for the first time since the will, reading the confusion was gone, replaced by something else. Not relief, not yet, but direction. Because this wasn't just proof that something was wrong, this was proof that she knew it was wrong and planned for it. She didn't leave me a problem, she left me a case, and as I looked back down at the box at the remaining compartment I hadn't opened yet, I realized this wasn't the end of what she had prepared, it was just the part she knew I would need to believe the rest. I carried everything out of that house like it could fall apart if I moved too fast. But the second I got back to my apartment, I spread the documents across my table and started going through them one by one, not emotionally this time, but methodically. Because whatever this was, it wasn't just a story. My grandmother wrote down it was evidence, and evidence only matters if you understand it. The third compartment in the box had already been opened by the police with a forensic tech present. So when I got access to copies of what was inside, it didn't take long to see the pattern bank statements. Dozens of them, not random, not scattered, but organized in chronological order, each one marked with small notes in my dates. Grandmother's handwriting, dates, circled amounts, underlined arrows connecting, transfers from one account to another, and every time I followed one of those arrows, it led to the same place, a personal account under my father's name. At first, I told myself there might be an explanation, some kind of authorized management, some technical reason that made sense if you knew how these things worked, but then I looked closer at the authorization forms attached to each transfer, and that's where it stopped being explainable. Each form had her base's annotation, to Greedon and Denau, signature, or at least a version of it, and next to several of them in pencil, she had written the same note over and over again. I did not sign this. This is not my handwriting. And it wasn't just once or twice, it was consistent across multiple documents, spanning nearly 2 years. I leaned back in my chair and counted, not because I needed an exact number, but because I needed to understand the scale, and the total came out to approximately $340,000, not a one-time mistake, not a miscommunication, but a sustained pattern of withdrawals that required planning, coordination, and a level of confidence that no one would question it. I picked up one of the statements and looked at the details. The dates aligned with times my grandmother had mentioned, feeling off moments she couldn't quite explain, small things that didn't make sense at the time, but now fit perfectly into a larger picture. And the more I read, the less room there was for doubt. This wasn't careless, it wasn't sloppy, it was structured. Someone had set this up in a way that would pass as legitimate unless you were looking for exactly what she was looking for. There was also a document related to the trust itself, a request to change the trustee and legal representative filed 6 months before she died, and the signature on that one looked even worse. Not just slightly off, but wrong in a way that didn't require expertise to notice the spacing, the pressure, the flow of the letters. It didn't match anything else she had written, and she had noted that too. "Not mine," she wrote in the margin, and I stared at that for a long second, because changing the trustee wasn't a small adjustment. It was control, it was access. It was the difference between oversight and ownership. I pushed the papers into a neater stack and tried to step back from it to see it the way someone else would see it, a lawyer, an investigator, anyone who didn't have my last name. And what I saw wasn't a family dispute. It was a system, a series of actions designed to move money out of her control and into theirs while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. And that part made me angrier than anything else, not just what they did, but how carefully they did it, how much thought went into making sure it wouldn't be questioned. I thought about the conversations I had overheard over the past 2 years, the vague references to handling things, the way my dad would mention financial decisions without details, the way my mom would redirect topics that got too specific, and all of it sounded different now, not like normal family dynamics, but like coordination, like they were managing something they didn't want anyone else to understand. My phone buzzed on the table, and when I looked at it, I saw a missed call from my father, followed by a text that simply said, "We need to talk." And for the first time, I didn't feel the usual hesitation about ignoring it, because now I knew what talk meant in his language. It meant control. It meant shaping the narrative before anyone else could question it, and I wasn't interested in participating in that version of events anymore. Instead, I went back to the documents and kept reading slower this time, not because I needed more proof, but because I needed to understand exactly how far this went, and with every page, every note, every signature that didn't match the picture became clearer and more uncomfortable. This wasn't just my father acting alone. The consistency of the transfers, the coordination required to maintain it, the legal documents that supported it, it all pointed to more than one person being involved. And that realization landed harder than the numbers did because it meant this wasn't a single bad decision, it was a shared one. I sat there for a long time after I finished, not moving, not reacting the way I thought I would, because the anger wasn't explosive, it was focused. It settled in a way that felt almost precise, like it had a direction instead of just a reaction. And that was new for me because for most of my life, I had been the one who absorbed things, who let them pass, who told myself it wasn't worth the conflict. But this wasn't something I could minimize or reinterpret to make it easier to accept. This was documented, verified, written down by the one person in my family who had no reason to lie to me. And as I looked at the stack of papers in front of me, I realized something that shifted everything else into place. They weren't just counting on her silence, they were counting on mine too. And for the first time, that didn't feel like a safe assumption. I sat across from my attorney as she walked me through the filing we were about to submit, and for the first time since I found the box, everything felt structured, like there was a clear path forward challenge. The fake will present the original, introduce the financial records. Let the system do what it's supposed to do, simple in theory. And I held on to that simplicity longer than I should have, because it made the situation feel manageable. Like this was just a matter of evidence and process, not influence or timing or who knows who. The initial motion was clean, direct, supported by documentation that should have raised immediate concerns: forged signatures, unauthorized transfers, a second will that contradicted the one already filed. And when my attorney submitted it to the Fairfield Probate Court, she told me to expect resistance, but not denial without review. Not this fast, not this quiet. 2 days later, the ruling came back. Motion denied, no hearing, scheduled no request for additional documentation. Just a summary decision that treated everything we submitted like it didn't meet the threshold to even be discussed. And I remember reading summary datus it twice. Not because I didn't understand the words, but because I couldn't reconcile the speed of it with the weight of what we had provided. I looked up at her and asked the only question that made sense: how is that possible? And she didn't answer right away, not because she didn't know, but because she was deciding how much to say out loud. And when she finally did, it wasn't vague, it wasn't softened. "It doesn't happen like this," she said. "Not with this kind of evidence." And that was the moment the problem shifted from legal to something else entirely. She pulled a file toward her and turned it so I could see names, affiliations, membership records, things that don't show up in court documents, but matter just as much. The judge assigned to the case, Harold Kern, and my father, both listed as members of the same country club, multiple recorded visits over the past month, dinners logged, events attended. Nothing illegal. Nothing that would automatically disqualify him, but enough to raise questions about impartiality and suddenly, the denial made sense in a way that had nothing to do with the merits of the case. I leaned back in my chair and let that settle, not as a shock, but as confirmation of something my grandmother had already anticipated. She knew the system might not protect her. She wrote that down, she planned around it, and now I was seeing exactly what she meant. Not a conspiracy. Not something dramatic. Just a quiet alignment of interests that made it easier to ignore what was inconvenient. My attorney didn't waste time on frustration. She moved straight to options appeal, escalation, alternative jurisdictions, but each one came with its own complications, delays, costs, and the kind of uncertainty that stretches everything out long enough for people to lose momentum. And that's when I felt it, not panic but pressure, the kind that builds when every logical step forward meets resistance you can't directly challenge. At the same time, everything outside the courtroom started tightening too. My credit line was suddenly under review. Nothing officially denied, just delayed, questioned, slowed down enough to make it harder to keep the renovation going. Frank didn't say anything directly, but I could hear it in his voice when he talked about timelines, about payments, about how long he could keep his crew on. Something that wasn't fully funded. And I knew he was being patient, in a way that had limits. Then the call started, not casual, not conversational, direct, controlled. My father first, his voice measured, almost calm. "Whatever you think you found doesn't change anything," he said, not asking, not curious, just stating, like he was reminding me of my place in a situation he believed he still controlled. I didn't respond, not because I didn't have something to say, but because I was starting to understand that engaging on his terms was part of the problem. My mother followed different approach, emotional, urgent. "You're tearing this family apart," she said. "We can fix this if you just stop." And the shift between their tactics would have been almost strategic if it wasn't so predictable, one controlled, one reactive, both aiming at the same outcome, get me to step back before anything moved beyond their reach. I ended the call the same way I ended the first, without agreeing, without arguing, just ending it. Because at that point the pattern was clear, and the more I saw it, the less effective it became. A few days later, my attorney called again, and I could hear something different in her voice, not uncertainty, but resolve. "We're not staying here." She said this isn't a level field, and I didn't need her to explain what she meant, because I had already felt it, the way things stalled without reason, the way decisions were made without process, the way connections filled in the gaps where fairness should have been. "Then we go somewhere it is," I said. And that was the first time since the denial that it felt like a decision instead of a reaction, because being pushed into a corner only works if you accept the boundaries, and I wasn't interested in doing that anymore, not after everything I had already seen, not after everything my grandmother had prepared for me to find. I pushed the stack of documents across the desk and said, "Then we go federal," and my attorney didn't hesitate. She just nodded, like she'd been waiting for me to get there, because once you accept that the local system isn't neutral, you either back off or you change the field. And I wasn't backing off. Within a day, she had drafted a referral that reframed everything, not as a family dispute, not as a probate disagreement, but as potential federal crimes, bank fraud, forged financial instruments, conspiracy elder, financial abuse, across accounts that moved through federally regulated institutions. And when you say it like that, it stops being something a local judge can brush aside in 48 hours. She sent the package to the FBI field office in New Haven, with a clean timeline, copies of the original handwritten will, the fake will, filed by Gordon Blake, the annotated bank statements, and the authorization forms with signatures my grandmother had already flagged as false. And then we waited not long, which in itself told me something had landed. A week later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Miss Harper, this is Marcus Whitfield, retired special agent. I've been asked to consult on your case." His voice was calm in a way that doesn't ask for attention but gets it anyway, and he didn't open with sympathy or small talk. Asked for the facts, dates, documents, what I had, what I didn't, and what I could prove, not what I believed. We met at a cafe in Westport because he said he preferred neutral ground. He was already there when I walked in, jacket on, coffee, untouched, and the first thing he did was ask me to walk him through the sequence from the will reading to the discovery in the wall, not the feelings, the steps, and as I talked, he didn't interrupt, didn't nod along, just listened, and then asked precise follow-ups that made me realize he was mapping the case in real time. "You have originals," he said when I finished, and I nodded. "Recovered from your property, documented by responding officers," another nod. "That matters," he said, like he was checking a box that moved us forward. Within days, the Bureau opened a formal investigation. Subpoenas were issued for bank records, not summaries, not selected statements, full account histories, internal logs, authorization trails. And the difference between what I had and what they could access was immediate because they could see the back-end timestamps, IP logs, who initiated transfers from where and under what credentials. And once those came in, the pattern didn't just hold, it expanded. The same accounts, the same routing repeated over months, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes clustered, always consistent. Forensic document examiners reviewed the signatures on the Blake will and the transfer authorizations, and when the preliminary report came back, it wasn't cautious. It was clear, high probability of forgery across multiple documents. Consistent discrepancies in stroke order, pressure, and spacing. Things you can't fake perfectly across time, and they tied those findings to the timing of the transfers, which tied back to the accounts, which tied back to the same names. My attorney coordinated with the federal team, not leading, not following, just aligning, making sure everything we had matched what they were building. Chain of custody, document integrity, witness statements, and then she added something my grandmother had anticipated: a recorded statement, a video, deposition she had made months before she died, with a notary present in it. She states clearly that any will produced by Gordon Blake after a specific date is not hers, and that she feared her son-in-law and daughter were taking money from her trust. And when we watched it in the conference room, there was no ambiguity. Her voice was steady, her language precise, no confusion, no peripheral hesitation, exactly the kind of record that closes the door on claims that she didn't understand what she was doing. The momentum shifted fast after that, not emotionally, structurally. The same people who had been comfortable ignoring the issue locally were suddenly subject to federal process. And process at that level doesn't ask for permission. It requires compliance, subpoenas, carry deadlines, interviews are scheduled, records are produced in full, not curated. And when my father's attorney called this time, the tone had changed, less confident, more careful, asking what we wanted, suggesting a resolution, offering terms that would have sounded generous a week earlier and now felt like an attempt to contain damage, keep the documents out of public record, trade silence for a payout, and my attorney declined before I had to say anything. "We're not negotiating around forged documents," she said, and that was the end of that conversation. The Bureau continued building the case, layering evidence so it didn't rely on any single piece. Financial trails, forensic reports, the original will, the deposition witness accounts from the contractor and responding officers, even peripheral details, like prior requests to change trustees, that matched the timing of suspicious activity. And as each piece came in, the picture stopped being something you argue about and became something you present. I met Marcus again to review where things stood. He summarized it without drama. "You have motive, access, method, and documentation," he said. And you have it from multiple sources that agree with each other, then he added. That's how cases hold, not by one strong point but by many that line up. Walking out of that meeting, I realized the part that had changed wasn't just the level of authority involved, it was the direction of pressure for the first time since the will reading. It wasn't on me to prove I wasn't. I mistaken it was on them to explain evidence that didn't match their story. And that reversal didn't feel like relief, it felt like alignment. Like the facts were finally in the same place as the process meant to evaluate them. I walked into the federal courthouse that morning with my attorney on one side and Marcus on the other, and for the first time since this started, I wasn't trying to predict what would happen next because everything that mattered was already documented, already verified, already in the hands of people who were actually going to look at it. Inside the courtroom, the setup was familiar, but the tone wasn't. No quiet assumptions, no unspoken alliances. Just a judge who hadn't had dinner with my father, and a process that didn't move faster for anyone's convenience. My parents were already seated at the defense table, my father in a charcoal suit posture, straight expression, controlled but tighter than I'd ever seen it. My mother beside him, hands clasped, eyes moving more than usual, not scanning the room but avoiding it, and my sister sat a few seats back, not on either side, not aligned, just present. When the judge entered, everything shifted into place, not dramatically, just precisely like a system, finally doing what it was designed to do, and my attorney stood, outlined the case in a way that didn't rely on emotion or interpretation, just sequence original. Handwritten will dated, and witness subsequent will filed by Gordon Blake that contradicted it, forensic analysis indicating the signature on that later document was not written by my grandmother, bank records showing repeated transfers from her trust into an account controlled by my father, authorization forms bearing signatures that did not match verified samples, and a recorded statement from my grandmother confirming she did not authorize those changes and believed funds were being taken without her consent. The defense objected where they could, but each objection was met with documentation, chain of custody, expert reports, not arguments, and the judge allowed the evidence to stand, not because it was compelling, but because it was supported, which is a different standard entirely. When the forensic examiner testified, he didn't speculate. He explained differences in stroke sequence, pen pressure, spacing patterns that remain consistent in genuine signatures and break down when someone is imitating them, and when he stated the probability that the signature on the Blake will was not my grandmother's, the room didn't react, not audibly, but the shift was there, subtle but real. The financial analyst followed, walked through the transfers, dates, amounts, frequency, how they aligned with the authorization forms, how those forms aligned with the same questionable signatures, and how the destination account remained consistent. And again, no drama, just a sequence that didn't require interpretation. Then the video played, my grandmother sitting in a chair stating clearly that any will produced after a certain date was not hers, that she was of sound mind, and that she believed funds were being taken from her trust, and for the first time the case had a voice. Not mine, not my attorney's, but hers, and it didn't ask for sympathy, it stated facts. My father's attorney called no witnesses, and that in itself said more than any argument could have, because when there's nothing to counter the structure of a case, you don't add noise, you limit exposure. When it was over, the judge didn't take long, not because it was simple, but because it was clear. The ruling was read in a steady, measured tone. The will filed by Gordon Blake was declared fraudulent and void. The original handwritten will was recognized as the valid testament. The financial transfers were identified as unauthorized and done. Part of a pattern consistent with fraud, and charges were entered accordingly. Forgery, bank fraud under federal statute, elder financial abuse, conspiracy, and as each charge was listed, it felt less like a shock and more like confirmation. Not because I expected it, but because it matched exactly what had been laid out piece by piece. When the marshals stepped forward, there was a moment where everything paused, not officially, just humanly. My father stood, said nothing. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but because there wasn't anything left that would change what had already been established. My mother spoke not to the papeless court, not effectively, just words that didn't land anywhere, and my sister didn't move at all. Just watched, like she was seeing the same structure I had seen weeks earlier finally become visible to everyone else. Outside the courtroom, the air felt the same as it had before. Nothing about the building or the street had changed, but the context had, and that's what matters, because the difference between being ignored and being heard isn't always volume, it's where the facts are allowed to exist. In the weeks that followed, the outcomes became official sentences assigned, assets restored, documents corrected, not as a favor, not as a gesture, but as the result of a process that had finally been applied without interference. And when I went back to the house on Birch Hollow, it didn't feel like a consolation anymore. It felt like what it had always been, a place that held something real, until I was ready to find it. I stood in the living room, where the wall had been opened now, rebuilt clean, solid, and for a second I thought about everything that had to line up for this to happen. Not just the evidence, but the decision to follow it all the way through, even when it would have been easier to stop, to accept the version of the story that required less resistance. And that's the part that stays with, to me, not the outcome, not the sentences, not even the money, but the fact that the truth doesn't move on its own. It doesn't push back when it's ignored. It just sits there until someone is willing to carry it forward. And once you do, once you stop adjusting yourself to fit what other people say is real, and start working with what actually is, everything else either aligns with it or falls apart. And either way, at least you know where you stand.